What up? I'm Matthew Singati, the designer and developer. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Coded Design, where I teach coding and user interface design. In this video, I want to talk to you about what I'm busy with behind the scene. Behind the scene, I'm busy with Philantro. What is Philantro? Philantro is a coding philosophy that comes with practices and coding libraries. What are those coding libraries? The first coding library that I've developed myself, it's a front-end library which I call it Philantro UI for user interface. So Philantro UI helps me with doing all the function, the JavaScript function that I'm supposed to perform in the user interface or on my HTML interface. For instance, validating input. Whenever you click a button without putting anything on your text box or on the text box input, then suppose the program or JavaScript is going to throw an error message to say that you can't continue with empty string or your inputs are empty. So Philantro UI helps me with all of that. It takes care of all of those things. So basically how it works is I've got a function that I pass to as parameters. I passed all my user input which are inside a div element. So Philantro UI will go look through all those inputs and validate if they are not empty. If it has found one input that is empty, then it will throw a message and it will highlight that input in red to say that please fill in this information. So that's a summary of Philantro UI. Secondly, I've got Philantro DB, a class, a PHP script or a class that helps me with connecting and querying to the database. So instead of me writing multiple SQL statements and writing SQL queries a lot of times, repeating myself, then I've got this class. So in this class Philantro DB, I just call some methods to execute the query for me. So I've got method that creates a record, methods that update a record, method that delete also a record. So those are the two libraries that you find in Philantro. However, as I have written here, Philantro is a coding philosophy. So what do I mean by a coding philosophy? When I'm talking about a coding philosophy, I'm talking about a concept. I'm talking about conceptualization. I'm talking about a thought process. I'm talking about my own voice in software development in general. So basically, in short term, Philantro is just my own experience, like the philosophy part of it. It's how I see the world or my own opinion. So it's not like it's written rules about what needs to be done, but it's whatever that I have learned and what I think is right. So now let's get into it. So in Philantro, I've got Philantro concepts. Also, Philantro helps me to organize all the information that I have learned from different YouTube channels and from different books and different developers and authors to make it format. As you are aware that in university, you get into university and then you have to do a course. Maybe it's going to be a 3-year course. In that 3-year course, you're going to be introduced to different, let's say, programming concept if you are taking an IT course based on different levels. On year 1, you're going to be given certain information, on year 2 certain information, and on year 3, and that information is well organized and it has been structured in such a way that it's easier for you to understand. However, when you are a developer or a freelancer or studying from YouTube and a lot of coding books, sometimes it's very tough to make sense of all of that information, because in this video you will hear this information and in the next video you will hear a contradicting information from that one. A practical example will be, is it a good thing to do to put comment in your code? There are some people who are saying it's good to put comment in your code so that another developer can understand what you were trying to do, so that you can explain more things that you cannot explain with a code. However, some people are saying you don't have to comment your code, because that will mean that your code is not self-expressive. Your code doesn't express itself. So they say you must write your code in such a way that it explains itself. So how do you then make sense of these contradictory and strong statements? So I've decided to create Philantro to write a sum total of my own experience and how I see things, so that it can be easier for me to memorize what I've learned and also to put it into practice without forgetting it. So without further ado, let's get into Philantro concept. Concept number one is avoid magicians. What are magicians? Variables and method with no traceable declaration point. I realized as I was coding, when I'm coming back to my coding 2 weeks later, I will have variables that are working very nice for me in my program because they display what they have to display. But when I'm tracing back, trying to find out where is the point of declaration, where am I assigning content to that variable, that is going to be a mission and a half. It will take me 2 or 3 days to really find out where I was declaring those variables. This happened in most cases in my PHP code with sessions. So in a different class, I will assign a username to a session variable, and then in a different class, in another class and another script, I will use that variable to display, to render it into my HTML navigation. So now when I'm trying to trace back after some time writing the code, I will realize that I have forgot where did I assign that username to that session variable. Obviously that slows down my coding or the progress of my overall development, and also it doesn't contribute to making my code clean. So I call those magician. As you know, that magician are people who have got the capability of making things to appear and disappear, and it always puzzles us, how is that happening? So being puzzled with your own code or in your code, I think it's a bad programming practice, or it's a sign that you are doing something wrong. And then number two is avoid sponge method. What a sponge method? Method that returns nothing by terminating the program. So the reason why they return nothing is because they terminated the program. I strongly believe that whenever you do a method call, whenever you call a method, in most cases you are expecting that method to return something, or at least to display or to render something to the screen. So obviously if this method is not going to render something to the screen, then it must be that you are interested in returning something to you. What if that method for some reason decides to terminate the script, and obviously there will be nothing that will be returned because the script has terminated. So the request response cycle has not completed because that method decided to terminate the program. So that will mean that will be a sponge method, a method which was supposed to return something but for some reason has decided to terminate the whole program. What are the cases whereby a method can terminate a program? As far as my experience goes, I've realized that when I have been careless with my if-else statements, when they are leaking. What are leaking if-else statements? If-else statement, I believe they are supposed to work with only one condition, so that that condition can be the only true condition at a time. So meaning that if the other condition will be true, at least it must be of a different thing, or it will be true on the next cycle when the variable that you are testing on has changed. It becomes a very big problem when you are having if-else statements and realize that even though the first possibility is true, the if-else statements the following if-else statement can still be true also. This then makes you to be confused or to have a fear that once a certain condition is true, it must terminate the whole program and return whatever it has to return, because you've got a fear that, or you've got a hunch or a feeling that another condition might be true. So in order to solve that problem, what you will do, you will terminate the entire execution, not knowing that after this method, maybe the main or the controlling program will still call another method to do other calculation to get a response from. So if this one now terminates the program, that means the program doesn't continue to fulfill what it was supposed to do. Then it becomes a method, so it will always return some sort of an empty context. I call those methods sponge method. Why they are sponge method? Let's take, if you take a golf ball and throw it into the wall, it will bounce back. But if you take a golf ball and throw it into the sponge, it's not gonna bounce back, it's gonna absorb it. So that's why I call this method sponge method. They don't bounce back the request, instead they just absorb it. Just like the magicians, these sponge methods, they delay you or they hinder your progress, making it slow, and also they don't contribute into a clean code. Going to number 3, empty method calls. In PHP, if you're not gonna use the keyword echo to render your HTML or your string HTML into the screen, don't think automatically if you are calling a method that return a string, that string is gonna be rendered automatically into an HTML. No, that's not gonna happen. So if I just call a method that returns Matthew as a string, so if I just call it on a blank space, then that method is not going to be rendered. So it becomes an empty method call because it just disappears. But however, if you call that method and display it, for instance, you will say echo render name, and then that method will return Matthew as a string, then that name Matthew can be displayed, can be rendered as an HTML page. However, if you just call the method render name without echoing it, it will just disappear. So it will be an empty method call. In my experience with PHP, I have struggled with that because I got this thing wrong. I got it twisted. I thought if I am displaying something or I'm just throwing a variable somewhere in a space, for some reason it's going to be cached by HTML and it's going to be automatically rendered, and that is not the case. It will always be an empty method call. That means it will just disappear. Number 4, highly traceable code. Obviously we talk of a clean code, and also a clean code means this to this developer and this to that developer, and also we've got different views about the same thing. In my own experience and my own understanding, I would like to believe a highly traceable code is a foundation, it's a building block of a clean code. If after 2 years you can come back to your code lost, obviously, but you are able to trace back from the event that from the trigger, whatever that caused the action to take place, and then from then you can trace your code from front end JavaScript and then also to your PHP and also to your database until you reach the end without being confused, then that is highly traceable code. That means at least somebody else can look at your code and they can figure out what's going on without being lost. So to me, I think clean code, the foundation or the first step to it, as much as it has got different lot of things and people have got their own way of viewing it and what it means to them, but to me at least it means a highly traceable code, easy to follow an event to the end. So whatever happens to the user interface when somebody was clicking the login, am I able to follow through that from this step we're calling this method, from this step we're calling this method, until the request response cycle is finished. Point number 5, class context. Let's talk about object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming is about creating classes and the corresponding objects. However, if you are too technical about it, you understand how to create classes, method and properties and default constructors and all those things, and also you can instantiate object, and you end there. That will mean that you only got the context of object-oriented programming. As I have been creating real life classes, not those ones which are cats and dogs and animal and a dog inheriting from an animal class, when I was dealing with real life object, I realized that it's very important to understand the overall concept, the overall context of that object. What might be the overall context? Let's say I'm creating an e-commerce application, and in this application, I've been given a duty or a task to create the class items. So I need to understand what are those items, because items can mean a lot of things to different people and also to different application. But in case of e-commerce, these are going to be items that are going to be sold. So I think it's very important for me not only to understand that these are items that are going to be saved to the database and also be displayed into a user interface, but I need to understand in the business context, what are items? Do these things have barcode? Do they have properties? Do they have expiring date? That will be getting the context of the class. So in terms of the description, as I said, it's intense knowledge about the object or class in real world. So if you want to create meaningful and useful object, it's very important that not only you deal with the content, also try to get an in-depth understanding about the context of a class. Point number 6, context oriented. This point also talks to point number 5, towards meaningful object that simulates reality. So I'm trying to say we must make it a practice to be context oriented, meaning that our classes must be a real life simulation, like must be an exact simulation of a real life, instead of me having a class, let's say create order, that just creates order and then and that's it, or it retrieves a list of orders and that's it. I think there is more to an order class than just creating an order and retrieving it. So I think point number 6 pushes us towards meaningful objects that simulate reality. So instead of just only being object oriented, also you must be context oriented in your classes. Point number 7, class and object nature. A class is not an object. If you want to grasp and understand the concept of object-oriented programming, the first thing that you must do is to draw a distinct line between a class and object. Most people use these words interchangeably. A class is not an object. A class is an entity unto itself, and an object is an entity unto itself. However, there is a very strong relationship between them. For instance, the other one is a implementation, a concrete implementation of the other, and the other one is a blueprint for the other. That holds true, but however, that doesn't mean a class is an object. Why a class is not an object? Because there are methods and properties which are called static method that only belongs to a class, that you will never use or that you will never see in an instantiated object. Obviously you can use them through that object, but they have got nothing to do with that real concrete object. Going to point number 8, assumed variable. In inheritance, using undeclared variable in a class, assuming that they will be declared in a child class and vice versa. In inheritance, we've got a parent class and a child or a subclass. So there is a relationship between a parent and a child, of course. In object-oriented programming, you are able in a parent class to use variables using this keyword which are not declared in that parent class, assuming that the child that will inherit from that class will declare that variable. So as soon as that child declares that variable, when you instantiate that child, then whatever you've been using as a variable, it's gonna be executed properly without an error, because even though it has been declared in a superclass or a child class, even though it has been used without being declared in a superclass or a parent class, as long as the child class is gonna declare it and then assign something to it, then everything can work properly. Why is that so? Why a parent class will use a variable that it has not declared? Simply because, take a parent class as a half class, it is only complete once it combines with a subclass, and then they make one class. So meaning that as much as you can use a variable in a superclass, as long as it's going to be declared and be assigned something, a content into it, into a child class, there won't be a problem. But as soon as you use a variable in a superclass, that won't be declared and it won't be available, you won't even going to receive it through parameters in a child class, then there will be an error. So I call those variables assumed variables. Those are the variables that you use them in a superclass, assuming that they will be declared or they will be available in an inheriting child class. Point number 9. Then, because of point number 8, then this create detector parent. Any parent class that uses an assumed variable. That assumed variable create a certain contract between the superclass and a child class. And what that contract is that variable must be declared or must be available in a child class. So the superclass that uses assumed variable automatically alienates all the child classes or the inheriting classes that won't have that variable. So if you are inheriting from that class and you don't have that variable, then it will mean that that child class or inheriting class won't be a child for this detector class. So it's like whenever you use assumed variables in your superclass, it will mean that automatically you are dictating how the child class is supposed to be. If it doesn't have that variable, it cannot be the child of that superclass. If it has that variable, then it can be a child. I will have to skip number 10 because I have realized that the naming doesn't really relate or talks more about the content. So it's like my naming hasn't been a proper naming for it. So let's go to number 11, class construction. So because of, I think, point number 6 and point number 7, this then take us to point number 11. Now if you are in object-oriented programming, you are creating classes. Must you be content driven or context driven? Content driven is just knowing how to instantiate classes, how to create them properly, and that's it. Context driven, it's going beyond that. It's understanding these items and these classes in real life so that your content on inside a class can simulate reality, so that you can really solve the problem. So must we drive towards context or towards content? To me, I think it's balancing between the two. Sometimes if you've just got content, you're gonna have empty classes that are not meaningful, that does nothing besides querying information from the database and doing minor calculation. Also, if you only have the context of a class, that will mean that you won't implement that because you are not aware of the content, what goes inside a class. So for me, it's just a bit of balance between the two. The next page. Point number 12 talks of self-aware view elements. View HTML elements must carry within themselves primary keys or crucial data. So as I've been working with HTML and also requesting information from the database, as you know that if in a list of items I have clicked a certain item and I want more information about that item, when I'm going to the database, querying to the database, I need to know the primary key of that item so that I can query all the information relating to that primary key. So meaning that if I'm clicking this item and I want to display more information, it's either I go back to the database trying to find out more about this item that I have clicked, or what I can do, I can, when I'm rendering that list through PHP, I can, in that HTML tag, push through some of the information that I think might fit there, so that when I want to display more information in the UI, so that I can simply pull that information in that HTML tag instead of creating a request from the database, going to my PHP script, connecting, and then connecting to my PDO, and then getting the information again. So this is what I'm trying to say. You must create self-aware views or elements, meaning that number one, these elements must carry within themselves their unique corresponding database primary keys, so that when you click on them, they can pull that information from that tag or from themselves. Those tags must be self-aware. They can pull that information from themselves, so that you can use that primary key or that unique number to query with it database from the information. Or what you can also do, you can also, that tag, that HTML tag, or let's say it's an LI, that means it forms part of a list, in its attribute, you can also put more information there. For instance, you can put, if maybe in that list there is an item description, you can put that item description as an attribute in that HTML tag, something that the user won't see, but as soon as the user hovers around that HTML, you can pick up that attribute and then display it somewhere, so that when the user hover on that HTML item, so that a corresponding description could be displayed, so that the user can have more idea about this item, or even the HTML element, a button or a text box. So that's the meaning of self-aware view elements. Going to point number 13, types of view request. I realized that as I am working with HTML, JavaScript, making request to PHP, I realized that there is a certain type of request that I'm doing. So in a way, it's not like I'm requesting random request, new request every time. I just realized that there is a certain group of HTML, a certain group of requests that I'm requesting from the back end, and that group, according to me, obviously it's not limited, but this is what I've discovered so far. jQuery HTML, sorry man, query HTML. What does that mean? In most cases, in your application, in your PHP application, you will request information from the back end, but you are interested on getting back an HTML string, a list that has already been rendered, that you are just going to push to the HTML or to the DOM when you are done receiving it. So you are not interested on getting a JSON array or JSON string, where in the front end you will look through all that JSON string and render a list and render the tag. You want to get it as an HTML string that has already been rendered, that is already a list that you are just gonna push into the DOM, then it will be displayed. So I call those query HTML. Also, you might some of the view requests that it might request from the back end, it's query JSON. So meaning that you want to query information from the database, but however you don't want to receive it as a rendered HTML string, but you want it as a JSON. And then the last one, it's a boolean. Under what circumstances would you want to request a boolean from the back end? For instance, in the login, when you click a login button, you are only interested on knowing if does the user exist or it doesn't exist. If it exists, then you want to check if is the username and the password they are matching. So as you can see that if you want to know does the user exist, the answer to that is true or false. If you want to know does the username and the password match, the answer there is true or false. So in a way, a view or an HTML page has got a certain group of requests that it asks, or it generates, or it asks to from the back end, and those requests are query HTML, query JSON, and Boolean. I'm not saying those are limited to those, but these are what I've noticed so far. How does this knowledge help you? How does it improve your skill as a developer? What I've realized is that whenever, first of all, I specialized in single page application, so those pages that work intentionally without the page refresh, just like WhatsApp web application. So I realized that whenever I'm sending a request, I need to specify in my JSON string, or when in my AJAX call, that this request is interested in getting a boolean, so that my PHP can return a boolean, but obviously in form of a string. If I'm interested in getting a rendered HTML string, in my request in my AJAX call in jQuery, I must specify that I'm interested on getting an HTML, and the same applies when I want to get a JSON string. Going to point number 14, picky views. What are picky views? Picks a class to that will process a request instead of creating a need for back-end conditionals. Obviously, I said I'm specializing in single page applications, so those applications that work properly without a page refresh. However, the pages that uses almost a get method, and also they always refresh, so meaning that as soon as you, whatever request that you do, it must always refresh. You will realize that in the back end of your code, more especially in the router, you will realize that there is a certain conditions that must be done. For instance, if the end part of the URL ends with login, then this is what must be done: load the login page. If it's about, log an about page. If it's this, then loads this. So as you can see, that method or that way of doing things calls for a lot of conditionals. You have to do a lot of if else, if else, if else. However, picky views, what they do, they send a post request, and also they tell the backend the class that they are interested in, and also they tell the method that they are interested in. So when the backend receives that request, it doesn't have to choose. If it's login, then this must be done. If it's home, then this what it must be done, because the post request or the AJAX call comes with it intentionally with the class and the method that it needs. So the backend doesn't have a choice but to only instantiate that class and call that method. So now the if else condition have disappeared, so it makes your life easier. Whenever you're gonna request something from the back end, the only thing that you have to do, you need to specify the class that you're interested in and the method in that class that is going to run. So when the back end receives that message, it doesn't have to make conditions, it just have to instantiate that class and then create that object. So that is point number 14, and that is a picky view. And then point number 15, request parameters: class, method, response, and data. What I realized as I'm creating these requests from my HTML and JavaScript, I realized that there is a certain group of things that I must send to my backend in order for my code to execute smoothly and also to make my life easier. So my request must always have these parameters: a class, as I've said on point number 14, a class that is going to be instantiated, the method name that is going to be called in that class, A response, it's a type of a response. Is it going to be an HTML, a Boolean, or a JSON? And then the data, meaning that the data that I'm interested in maybe saving into the database, or I am going to need inside the method that I'm calling. So this is just a summary of what I've noticed in any request that I do. In order for this request to be executed properly, obviously given the mini framework that I've created for myself, if I can tell the back end that this is the class that you must instantiate, this is the method that you must call inside that class, this is the type of response that I want when you are done with processing the request, and also this is the data that you can use to continue and execute whatever that you want to do. So that was point number 15, request parameters. Point number 16, pull down method. This method doesn't mean pull down function, but it means pull down method as an approach, like a certain method. Minimize the request by pulling down crucial data from self-aware element. I think this one talks to point number 12. It talks to this point number 12, self-aware view or HTML element. These are elements that when you are rendering them in your PHP script, make sure that they come with all the information that they need, so that when you are in the front end and the JavaScript is executing at some stage, or sometimes it must not always request that item description. You can just hang that item description when you are rendering that HTML into that li tag as an attribute, as an HTML attribute, so that you can use a pull down method, like pulling an apple from the tree, so that the jQuery or the JavaScript can just pull that data from the attribute instead of going to the database, creating a request and getting that information back. Point number 17, types of classes. So as I'm working with object-oriented programming in PHP, I realized that there is a certain form of a pattern or a certain group of classes that I'm working on occasionally or most oftenly. And those classes include classes of the problem that you are actually solving. If maybe you are creating a fleet management system, those classes of that. If you are creating a school management system, those classes. And also if you are creating an accounting system, those classes, plus the classes of the framework that you are creating, assuming that when you are creating your whole thing without using Laravel or any other framework, it means that you have to create your own mini framework. So these are the classes that I've seen frequently. An app class and a class that is gonna act as an application, meaning that it will work with the router and it will work with dependency injection containers, and it will render some HTML output and make some major decisions. So it's like a main calling class. A router, a class that is responsible for channeling the request from the UI to the corresponding HTML to the corresponding PHP class or PHP script. So it's like it's controlling the traffic. It's like it receives the request from the UI and then it calls the corresponding class that will process that request. Variables. Sometimes you create classes with only a purpose of holding a list of variables. For instance, in Philantro UI, in my jQuery or JavaScript class, I've got a list of variables that are there, and those list of variables, they contain paths to different parts of the whole entire app, instead of always typing those paths. So when I want to use a certain path, maybe a path to images, it's already there in that class. So some classes at some point, they just exist for just holding variables. They don't do much work. but the reason why you create them as classes, you just want to instantiate them and use those variables. In most cases, you just create one associative array that will be there. Then that array will contain all those variables or those key value pairs. So sometimes you create classes just to hold variables. View template. In view, in model controller view or in MVC pattern, we've got the V for views. However, I've realized that even though you might have views, there is also another class that comes right after or right before the view, which is a view template. What is a view template? Let's talk about a landing page of an application. It has got multiple sections. It has got the header, it has got the menu, it has got whatever different sections. What if you want to rearrange the layout of those sections? What would you do? Would you create, let's say, another request that will have those corresponding views for only the rearranged layout? Or you can create a class called template that will help you in just arranging, positioning those rendered views in different places. So do you see that when you are creating a template, or the template, it's not a view necessarily, even though it's so close to the view, but what it does, it's more like a layout. It just work on rearranging things on the screen. And also, if you are going to have a view, let's say you are having one view that has got a lot of things, for instance, a landing page of an application. In that landing page, you might find out there is a list box that must already be populated so that I can click there and see users. At the same time, as there is a list box, there must be some sort of a chart that displays some sort of profit for the day or according to the days. So that view as a home view, it's composed of different views. So you need a template class that will render all those views independently. It will render the list view as if it's only a list view. It will execute its controller, it will execute the model, and it will take all the information from the model and populate into the view and keep that. Remember, it doesn't display it because it's not a view, it's a template. And then it will render the chart for displaying profit or daily sales report. It will keep that chart, and then from then it will position those things in different elements of an HTML container, and then when it's done with that, and then it will render that as a view. So the view template, it's a class, it's not a view, but it's very close to a view. It just rearranges and populates certain sections of a view so that it makes it easier for the view to be manipulated, so that if you want to change the header from being to the top, it being up to the bottom, you will use a template to do that. So that's also another type of a class. Controllers, it's C on the MVC. These classes are responsible for being a middleman between the view and the model. So model it interacts with the controller and it queries data from the database. It's very close to the database management system, so it feeds information as it is needed. Then we've got contextual classes. Contextual classes, I will explain them later because they are not necessarily a bit complicated, but the naming of that contextual classes doesn't really relate to the class itself, so I still have to work on that naming. And then we've got a factory class. A factory class is a class that is responsible for manufacturing dependencies. It's responsible for instantiating dependencies. For instance, let's say you've got a class item, it takes products as a dependency, but however the class products also has got multiple dependencies, so then you will need a factory to manufacture those dependencies for you, so that the factory can have time and energy to create all those dependencies. If this class needs some dependencies, it will create them. If this one needs some dependencies, it will create them. So the factory won't have a problem with that. But if you do that inside a class item, you will find out that now class item gets exhausted, because without even being concerned about things that relates to an item, it's busy newing things up, instantiating things, which is a problem. So where I was explaining the factory. Now we are going to point number 18, front back sync. Input names, variables, return types must be the same. Front back sync, it's like there must be some sort of a synchronization between the back end and the front end, or even the database management system. When in my experience with developing web application, I realized that if you have a variable, let's say txt name in your user interface, why would that if you've got not necessarily a variable, if you've got an input txt name, you are labeling an input, a place where the user is going to put something. If you have labeled that txt name, why in your JavaScript, when you are taking that information from that input, you are assigning to a variable, you are going to say the variable that you're going to assign that input from txt name is going to be, let's say, cars or dogs or whatever, because it starts to make a confusion. So if you can be consistent, if you've got an input txt name, then the corresponding variable name must be name. And then when you go to when you are passing those variable names through an ajax call in jQuery or in JavaScript, they must be those names, so that the PHP script can receive that name and still assign it under a variable name. And then when you are going to the database, the column that is responsible for containing that information, also it must be named. So there must be consistency between all your layers in terms of the input names, the variable names, the return type. The return types must be the same. So this means whenever I'm talking about the return types must be the same, if in the front end I'm expecting true, the back end also must return true. It doesn't make sense for a function in the front end or in JavaScript returning a boolean or expecting a boolean, and then in your PHP script you are returning success when the user is logged in. Then that means that misunderstanding might affect the whole entire application. So in this point number 8, I'm trying to create uniformity, and also Philantro as a mini framework, having Philantro DB or Philantro backend and Philantro UI. It's helping me to create or to reinforce that uniformity or that consistency, or it's helping me to synchronize my layers, so that I know that if I'm having these variables in the front end, they must continue to the back end and they must continue to the database, so that if I want to trace back where is this coming from, let's say I'm in the database side of things, I might know that I'm going to look for a corresponding student name in the business logic, and also I'm going to look for a corresponding name in the JavaScript student name, and also I'm going to look for a corresponding text input txt student name in my HTML IDs. Point number 19, view is a table. View items has a corresponding table items. View inputs are table attributes. So here, this is what I'm saying. There is a relationship between the user interface element and the database table. And in most cases, you will realize, let's say we are creating a course or a school management system, and then we've got courses. If you look at courses, the course as a course name, a duration, how long is it gonna take. It has got, let's say, the lecturer who's instructing the course, and let's just stick there for now. So as you can see that if you look at your corresponding data table or the database table, you will realize that it almost has got the same things. It has got the lecturer name, it has got the course name, and also it has got the duration. So there is a relationship, a strong relationship between the two. So when I'm saying a view is a table, I'm just reinforcing that your table, you can copy your views, your view element, your view input element from your table, and also you can copy your table from your view elements. So in a way, I'm encouraging the idea that these things work in hand, because a view feeds the database, and the database also feeds the view, because the view gets the information from the database. Hence I'm saying view item has a corresponding table item. A student, a txt student input has got a student column in the database. So these are the same thing. Hence I'm saying view input are table attributes. So these things are the same, and when you are developing and creating your own application, if you can have that understanding that these things are the same. So if you've got a user interface, you can even some sort of see how your table structure is going to be. If you've got a table structure, you can even see how your view inputs are going to be. However, whatever that you see on a user interface as input, that doesn't mean those are the only table attributes that you're going to have, because there are some additional table attributes that you don't see them as input corresponding HTML tags, or you don't see in the user interface. Point number 20, manufactured input. Using table attributes to auto-generate HTML input. As I've been working with HTML, JavaScript, and also PHP, the need arose for me to some sort of generate the inputs, not to always type them. So in most of my application, I have got an array that has got all my input attributes of the database. For instance, let's talk about items. An item name, it's an input database attribute or table attribute. Item name, item ID, it's not an input attribute because I don't get it from the user. So I will list all the input attributes of the table, all those attributes that I will get from the user. Once I'm done with that, I will use that associative array with PHP to render all the inputs for my tables. For instance, let's say we've got a class item, courses, and lecturers. When I'm rendering an input view for lecturers, I go to that associative array that have got the input attributes for me, a list of those attributes. Then I will look through that array and create the corresponding input. For instance, let's say in the array for input attributes for lectures, then there will be the lecture name, obviously the mobile number, and then email, and then let's say the course, which course is he instructing. As you can see that the lecture name, the lecture mobile number, and the lecture email, those are just input text boxes. That means you will put information in. But this one, courses, it's a list because somebody has to choose the, are you instructing IT or whatever course that you are instructing, chemistry or what, and so forth. So as you can see that the last one, it's a list item. So what I will do in that array, I will mention that the first three, they are text input, and the last three, I will indicate that it's a list item. And also I will have to tell the system where is it going to get the list item. That means also that will be another query to a certain table, which is table courses, to get all the courses that are offered. So what I will do with that, I will automatically generate my input. How does this makes my life easier or speed up the process? It means that the input views, I don't have to write HTML for them, because my PHP script can create the corresponding input views for those. That means it's less typing HTML and CSS, because we already have those styled. So PHP can render those input views for me. So those are manufactured input. So I'm trying to say you can manufacture your input instead of typing them every time. Point number 21, it's a no termination rule. I think this one speaks in one of the points that I have covered, that there must only be one class that will have a right to terminate the program. I think it talks to it's not sponge method. Let me just go back. Avoid empty method call these. Yes, it's sponge method that returns nothing by terminating the program. So this one, point number 21, no termination rule, it talks to that. It means that no sponge method, the method that absorb the request because they terminate the script. There must only be one class that will have the right to terminate the script. In my experience and my own case, the class application is the one that decides whether to terminate the entire script, because it is its responsibility. So it's more like sticking to the solid principles, the S, which is single responsibility. Point number 22, HTML view versus view component. HTML suggests one file, components suggest different files working as one. So in the model view controller, in the MVC pattern, we've got a view. I have seen in most YouTube tutorial and in most developers that whenever they talk of a view, they are talking about an HTML file or a PHP file that contains HTML. As I was developing and getting my own experience and getting my own understanding about the whole concept of MVC, I have migrated from having an HTML file as a view to having a component. What's the difference? When you talk of a view as an HTML file, you are talking about one file. However, a user interface or an HTML page is not made by HTML. It's made by HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So viewing a view as one file, to me, doesn't really help me, and it doesn't speed up my development. It doesn't make my life easier. But viewing a view as a component, first of all, it changes from being a file to a folder. So meaning that when I'm talking about a login view, I'm talking about a folder in my server that has got the HTML, that has got the CSS, and that has got the JavaScript. So these things work together to bring what we called a login screen, because without that HTML, without that HTML, the JavaScript doesn't work. Without that HTML, the CSS is useless, or it doesn't work. So instead of thinking about a view as a single HTML file, think of a view as a component, as a folder that has got different files working together. So in my mini framework structure, what I do, I have got a folder. Oh no. In my HTML file, I have a folder which is, let's say, a login view or whatever view, and that view has got three files: the HTML, the JavaScript, and the CSS. However, there is an additional PHP file which is always named hook.php. So in all my views, I've got those four files, and that hook.php is always spelled the same. It's always like that. It's hook.php. What does that hook PHP file does? Whenever I'm going to render a login component, which is more like a view, I will use that hook PHP. That hook PHP automatically assigns the JavaScript to the system and also that CSS to the system. So how does that makes my life easier? What if maybe I want to reuse that component, meaning that those 4 files, to a different application? It will mean that number one, I will just copy that folder. That folder contains HTML, it contains CSS, it contains JavaScript, meaning that now a component is a self-contained view. Instead of viewing a view as a single HTML, when I'm copying that HTML to a different application, it's there, the HTML text, but it's ugly because there is no CSS to style it, and also there is no JavaScript to bring it to life. So I'm migrating from viewing a view as an HTML page, but as a component. A component, it's all these 3 files plus the hook for adding. The hook is for adding the JavaScript and also the HTML file. Point number 23, I think I've already mentioned this one, that by viewing a view as a component, you create self-contained views that are an entity unto themselves. They are a fully fledged some sort of a component, and they are reusable because you can copy them as they are. Wherever they go with their own HTML, they go with their CSS, and they go with your JavaScript, and they always have a hook by which an external application can use in order to acquire the CSS, in order to embed the CSS and also to embed the JavaScript into the system. For me, Matthew Singati, that is the end. These are just 23 points. They are just a sum total of my own experience. I hope you are learning something from them. I hope you're gonna use some of them to help you to speed up your development process. However, these are not rules, these are not principles, these are just things that I have noticed as I have been creating my own accounting system. So please make use of them. If you got some question or something that you want to ask, shoot a comment below and tell me, or what do you mean about this, or maybe you have seen one of the things that I have written here, maybe in a book or somewhere. I will be glad to know that, because some of these things I just have to come up with the terms myself. The idea behind is just for helping me to become a developer and also helping you to become a developer. If you feel like this has added more value into your overall understanding of PHP, please subscribe.